Welcome back to the Avoidant Decoded, where we go beyond the surface and decode the psychology behind avoidant behavior, emotional distance, and the connections that are hardest to understand. If you've ever wondered why someone can seem distant while still paying close attention, remembering everything, and struggling with emotional closeness, you're in the right place. Stay with me, because today we're uncovering the subtle signs that can reveal when you are far more emotionally significant than their behavior makes it seem. What if the person who keeps pulling away is not running because you mean nothing, but because you mean more than they know how to handle? When an avoidant truly becomes emotionally affected by someone, their behavior can become strangely contradictory. They notice more, remember more, reveal more, and then suddenly create distance. And if you know what to look for, those confusing moments can reveal something their words may never openly admit. The first important sign is heightened attention disguised as indifference. When an avoidant person considers someone emotionally significant, they may not suddenly become openly affectionate or constantly expressive. In fact, the opposite can happen. They may appear calm, detached, distracted, or even uninterested, while quietly paying close attention to everything happening around the connection. This is where their behavior can become confusing, because what they show on the surface does not always match what they are internally noticing. They may remember small details from conversations that you assumed they had forgotten. They may notice a change in your tone, your availability, your communication style, or the amount of attention you give them. They might recognize that something feels different before you ever explain it. Sometimes they will casually mention something you said weeks or months earlier, revealing that they were paying much more attention than their behavior suggested. The key is not to interpret every small observation as proof of deep feelings. Instead, look for a consistent pattern. When someone repeatedly notices your emotional shifts while simultaneously pretending that they do not care, there may be a significant level of psychological attention involved. Avoidant tendencies can create a strange contradiction. The person may want emotional distance while still remaining highly aware of the person from whom they are distancing themselves. This can become especially obvious when you stop pursuing them. If you become quieter, establish stronger boundaries, or simply redirect your attention toward your own life, they may suddenly become more observant. They may ask questions, initiate contact, or subtly check whether the connection is still available. That does not automatically mean they are ready for commitment, but it can reveal that your presence has more psychological importance than their detached behavior suggests. The deeper lesson is to stop measuring interest only through obvious affection. Some people show emotional significance through attention rather than words. They watch, remember, notice, and quietly track changes because the connection matters to them, even if vulnerability makes direct expression uncomfortable. But always remember, attention is not the same as emotional maturity. Someone can notice everything about you and still fail to communicate properly. What ultimately matters is whether that awareness eventually becomes consistent effort, honesty, respect, and healthier behavior. When attention turns into meaningful action, that is when you have something real to evaluate. The second important sign is controlled vulnerability. When an avoidant person sees someone as emotionally significant, they may slowly reveal parts of themselves that they normally keep protected, but instead of opening up completely, they often do it in small, carefully controlled moments. They might share something personal about their past, admit a fear, discuss an insecurity, or reveal an experience they rarely talk about. Then, almost as quickly as they open the door, they may close it again. This is where the behavior can become confusing. One moment there is genuine emotional openness, and the next there is distance, silence, or a sudden change in subject. It can feel as though the person regrets what they just revealed, but sometimes the retreat is actually connected to the importance of the moment itself. Vulnerability creates exposure. For someone who strongly values emotional independence, being seen deeply can feel uncomfortable because it creates the possibility of rejection, disappointment, dependence, or loss of control. Pay attention to what happens immediately after they become vulnerable. Do they suddenly become quieter? Do they minimize what they said with a joke? Do they act as though the conversation was not important? Do they create physical or emotional distance afterward? These reactions can indicate that the emotional exposure activated their protective instincts. However, it is important not to romanticize every withdrawal. Vulnerability followed by distance does not automatically mean someone secretly loves you. The real clue is whether the person gradually becomes more comfortable with emotional honesty over time. Someone who values the connection may eventually begin sharing more, communicating more clearly, or returning to conversations that previously made them uncomfortable. Think of vulnerability like opening a door that has been heavily guarded. They may open it for a few seconds, realize how exposed they feel, and quickly close it again. The important part is not forcing the door open. Pressure can make someone retreat even further. Instead, emotional safety comes from allowing honesty without punishment, humiliation, or excessive demands. At the same time, you should maintain your own boundaries. Understanding why someone struggles with vulnerability does not mean accepting endless emotional unavailability. Compassion and self-respect can exist together. The deepest sign is therefore not simply that an avoidant person tells you something personal. It is what happens after that moment. Do they slowly learn that vulnerability does not cost them their independence? Do they return to difficult conversations instead of permanently escaping them? Do they become increasingly comfortable being emotionally known? When vulnerability begins turning into consistency, trust, and genuine communication, the connection is no longer just emotionally intense, it is becoming emotionally meaningful. The third important sign is that you become difficult for an avoidant person to categorize emotionally. Most relationships feel safer when they can be placed into a clear box: friend, acquaintance, casual connection, or someone they can interact with without becoming emotionally exposed. But when someone becomes unusually important, those simple categories can begin to break down. The connection starts carrying emotional weight, and that can create an internal conflict between wanting closeness and protecting independence. This is why the behavior may suddenly become inconsistent. They may enjoy spending time with you, then feel the need to create distance. They may initiate contact and later become quiet. They may seem deeply interested during one conversation and unusually detached during another. From the outside, this can look like a lack of interest, but sometimes the inconsistency comes from competing emotional needs rather than the absence of feeling. The important thing is not to assume that every hot and cold pattern means deep attachment. Instead, observe whether there is a recognizable conflict around emotional closeness. Someone who is completely uninterested usually does not spend much energy struggling with intimacy, but someone who wants connection, while simultaneously fearing dependence, may repeatedly move toward closeness and then attempt to regain emotional control. You may notice that the person becomes more cautious when conversations become emotionally serious. They might change the subject when feelings are discussed, become uncomfortable with expectations, or suddenly emphasize the importance of personal space. Yet they may also react strongly when you become distant. This creates a psychological push and pull. Closeness feels desirable, but too much closeness feels threatening. Another clue is how they respond when you stop trying to define the relationship for them. If you remain calm, maintain your own life, and stop pressuring them for constant reassurance, they may gradually become more curious about the connection. They have room to approach voluntarily rather than feeling emotionally cornered. But this is where self-respect becomes essential. You should never spend your life interpreting contradictions while receiving little consistency in return. Understanding someone's attachment pattern can explain behavior, but it cannot justify behavior that repeatedly hurts you. The real evidence appears when the person begins resolving the contradiction instead of simply repeating it. They start communicating instead of disappearing. They explain their need for space instead of creating confusion. They return to difficult conversations rather than avoiding them permanently. They learn that intimacy does not require surrendering their identity. When someone can finally hold both truths at once, that they can love connection and still remain independent, the relationship stops being a constant psychological tug-of-war and starts becoming something emotionally secure and real. One of the deeper signs is that an avoidant person may quietly test whether emotional closeness feels safe. This usually isn't a deliberate game or a conscious attempt to manipulate. It can happen through observation. Instead of directly asking, "Can I trust you with my emotions?" they may watch what happens when they become vulnerable, disagree with you, ask for space, or reveal something personal. Their attention is often focused on how you respond when the connection becomes emotionally uncomfortable. For example, they may tell you something sensitive and then observe whether you judge them, dismiss them, become overly emotional, or use that information against them later. If you respond calmly and respectfully, they may remember that experience. Over time, repeated experiences of emotional safety can make it easier for them to lower their defenses. They may also create small amounts of distance and observe whether you immediately chase them. If every request for space turns into pressure, repeated messages, or emotional demands, the person may associate closeness with losing control. But if you can respect reasonable space without abandoning your own boundaries, you communicate something very different. Connection does not have to mean emotional captivity. Another test can appear during disagreement. An avoidant person may become uncomfortable when conflict becomes intense. They might withdraw, become quiet, or need time before continuing the conversation. What matters is what happens afterward. If they eventually return and attempt to communicate, that can show growing trust. If they repeatedly disappear without explanation, however, that is not something you should automatically interpret as hidden love. The same principle applies to boundaries. A person who is emotionally invested may quietly observe whether you can say no without becoming cruel and whether they can say no without losing the connection. Healthy boundaries teach both people that closeness does not require constant agreement or unlimited access. This is why emotional safety is not about becoming endlessly patient with someone. It is about creating a relationship where both people can be honest without fear of punishment. You can give someone space while still expecting respect. You can understand their discomfort without excusing inconsistency. You can remain compassionate without becoming responsible for managing their emotions. If you truly become important to an avoidant person, one of the most meaningful changes is that they may gradually discover they do not have to protect themselves from every emotional moment. They begin learning that vulnerability does not automatically lead to rejection, control, humiliation, or abandonment. And when someone begins feeling safe enough to communicate instead of constantly protecting themselves, the connection has moved beyond attraction and entered the territory where genuine trust can finally develop. When an avoidant person considers a connection emotionally significant, one of the most revealing signs can be how strongly they remember the things that happened between you. They may appear detached, move on quickly, or behave as though certain conversations were not particularly important, yet surprisingly specific details can remain in their memory. They might remember a sentence you said during an emotional conversation, a small preference you mentioned casually, an important event you discussed, or even the way you reacted during a particular moment. This doesn't necessarily mean they are constantly thinking about you, but it can show that the interaction left a stronger psychological impression than their outward behavior suggested. Avoidant tendencies often involve managing emotional intensity by creating distance. Distance can make someone appear less affected, but emotional distance does not automatically erase emotional memory. In some cases, stepping away from an intense interaction can actually give the person more time to privately process what happened. Instead of discussing their feelings immediately, they may replay conversations internally and think about what they should have said, what they felt, or why a particular moment affected them. This becomes especially noticeable when they unexpectedly bring up something from the past. Perhaps you assumed they had forgotten a conversation, but months later, they mention a detail connected to it. That moment can reveal that the experience remained mentally accessible. However, it is important not to turn every remembered detail into proof of romantic attachment. Some people simply have excellent memories, and meaningful memories can exist without a desire for a relationship. The stronger indicator is the emotional relevance of what they remember and whether that memory influences their behavior. Do they remember what makes you uncomfortable and try to avoid repeating it? Do they remember conversations about your needs? Do they recall previous misunderstandings and approach them differently? Do they remember the moments when they were vulnerable and gradually become more willing to discuss them? That is where memory becomes meaningful. There is also a difference between remembering someone and being emotionally ready for them. A person can remember you vividly while still being unable to maintain a healthy connection. They can miss certain moments while continuing to avoid difficult conversations. Therefore, memory should be viewed as a clue, not a conclusion. The most valuable sign is when remembered experiences become lessons. When someone takes what happened between you, reflects on it, and changes how they behave afterward, their memory has become emotional growth. Because ultimately, being remembered is not the highest form of significance. The deeper evidence is when what someone remembers inspires them to communicate better, act more consistently, and treat the connection with greater care. One of the strongest signs is internal conflict. When an avoidant person becomes emotionally attached to someone, the experience can create two opposing forces at the same time. One part of them may want closeness, connection, reassurance, and emotional intimacy, while another part may fear dependence, vulnerability, rejection, or losing personal control. This conflict can make their behavior appear confusing because they may move toward the connection and then suddenly create distance. You might notice moments when they seem genuinely comfortable and engaged, followed by periods where they become quieter or emotionally unavailable. They may initiate contact, enjoy a meaningful conversation, and then seem to need space afterward. The important point is not to assume that every withdrawal means hidden love. Instead, look for whether the person repeatedly struggles specifically with emotional closeness while still showing signs that the connection matters. Internal conflict often becomes visible after emotionally significant moments. Someone may open up, express affection, share something personal, or experience a deep moment of connection and then suddenly become more guarded. The emotional experience may have felt good, but it also made them feel exposed. Creating distance can then become a way of restoring their sense of control. Another sign can appear when the possibility of losing the connection becomes real. They may seem comfortable with distance until they realize that the other person is genuinely moving forward. At that point, their behavior may change. They might become more attentive, reach out, ask questions, or show more interest. Again, this does not automatically mean they are ready for a healthy relationship. Fear of loss and emotional readiness are not the same thing. The most important thing is to watch whether the internal conflict eventually produces growth. A person who is genuinely trying to build a healthier connection may slowly become better at communicating what they need. They may learn to ask for space rather than disappearing. They may return to difficult conversations instead of avoiding them forever. They may acknowledge their own patterns instead of making the other person responsible for understanding everything. You should also protect yourself from becoming trapped in endless interpretation. Internal conflict can explain why someone behaves inconsistently, but it does not make inconsistency harmless. You are allowed to expect communication, respect, and emotional responsibility even when someone struggles with closeness. Ultimately, the deepest sign is not that an avoidant person feels conflicted. It is whether they become willing to work through that conflict rather than making you live inside it, because genuine emotional significance becomes meaningful only when feelings eventually lead to greater honesty, consistency, and the courage to stay. Being the special one is not proven by how intensely someone pulls away, how often they return, or how much you can make them miss you. It is revealed through the deeper pattern. They notice you, remember you, become vulnerable with you, struggle with the closeness, and gradually begin confronting the fears that once made them retreat. But never confuse emotional conflict with emotional commitment. Someone can care deeply and still be incapable of giving you the consistency you deserve. The real turning point comes when their feelings begin producing healthier actions, when distance becomes communication, fear becomes honesty, and uncertainty becomes intentional effort. So don't chase every silence looking for hidden meaning. Watch the pattern, protect your boundaries, and let behavior tell you what words cannot, because the goal isn't to become unforgettable to someone who cannot stay. The goal is to be valued by someone who is willing to stay, grow, communicate, and meet you where genuine connection requires them to be.